Okay, good morning. We will have a quiz this week, Friday, or opening up Friday. It will be on ecology matters. Okay. Next, on Friday, we will have an invited speaker, Dr. Dan Robertson. He is a doctorate or PhD in eye physiology and color vision research. And then he has a doctorate in optometrist doctorate. I can't remember. OD. Thank you. So he works up at the Appleton VA right now, but he has extensive background on all things eye related. So I will have that as a testable thing. Okay, so please take notes, ask questions. He loves them as long as they're relevant. Okay, he's kind of like me, we can get distracted. Okay. So we're going to be finishing out ecology today and getting right on to phylogeny. So without any further ado, we finished up talking about things that affect population growth. And one of the major things is, two of the major things is we categorize them as density independent and density dependent things. When we talked about competition for nesting grounds for living in an area, an ecological niche, we call it. Also predation and disease states, as in high population or higher population means person to person or animal to animal spread of disease is much more likely. So in infectious disease terms, we can look at all these things for density dependent issues. The reason we can eat honey and babies cannot is because the honey has spores in it from a very nasty bacteria called Clostridium botulinum. It produces that neurotoxin that we studied in the neuroanatomy part of it. Now, the reason we don't get it when it is in the spore form is that we have a fully developed microflora, a complex ecological network of bacteria that use every bit of our nutrients and even metabolic byproducts in our gut. The Clostridium needs a number of different specialized nutrients to grow and germinate and start producing toxin. If it does not have those nutrients because somebody else is taking it and using it, it doesn't have the ecological niche to grow into. In this case, nutrients, a nutrient load to facilitate its growth. So adults have that niche filled. Young children, infants do not. They say below a year. I would go as far as a year and a half. I don't give kids honey. I don't care if they call it filtered, it's not filtered. It's mostly making sure you don't have any like wings in there. It's not microbially filtered. Okay. Now, we can get botulism if we have toxin pre-made in the food ingested. That does not disturb an ecological niche. Okay, so we have some bacteria that need to have that internalization and growth, and competition keeps it from occurring. Same with bacteria in our skin. Now, we can also have predation of those bacteria through specialized phages, viruses that attack specific bacteria and kill them or limit their numbers, and are more likely to be there if there are high numbers of their prey. We're making it sound like viruses are sentient, but they are just lines of code. They are much more likely to bump into the things they'll infect, though, if there's a high amount of the bacteria they'll infect. So all of these questions, these aspects of population control can be looked at even at the micro level. As much as we can talk about wolf packs in Yellowstone hunting down deer or buffalo, mostly deer. Kind of crazy to hunt down buffalo, it's not a good idea. Elk. Okay, and then of course the disease state part. For humans, epidemiologically, in clinical microbiology terms, we look at person-to-person spread. How does it spread person-to-person? If it doesn't, it's less of an issue. We can more easily control how organism spreads. SARS. SARS-1 spread person-to-person by coughing. We could easily tell who had it by a fever. Everybody got the fever. Everybody who was infected had symptoms. SARS-2, a lot harder. Only about 50% of the people who were infected and spreading it had symptoms, and they were all over the board. Only some had fever. Now, both of those, we had a lower death rate. Coronaviruses of those type, usually beta coronaviruses usually have a 9% death rate. But it can have person-to-person spread. MERS, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, acute respiratory syndrome, which is a similar coronavirus, similar but not identical. It's in the same family. Is passed camel to human. Yeah, 16% death rate. So we were quite blessed to have a pandemic with only a 1% death rate after we got all of our medical treatments figured out. But we always look to see if it's going to go person to person, because that would be a big problem if we had a person to person spread with 16% death rate. We haven't had that yet. It's only camel to human. So the spread rate is reduced. We have very little or very few infections a year with that. A couple people died this year of MERS already, but it's been in Saudi Arabia. Not that it's not a horrible thing, but it's not 10,000 people. Okay, so we can look at density dependency of density dependent population effects. Okay, if you have fewer people around, it's going to spread less well, less effectively, things like that. Now, if there's a fire, if there's an earthquake, unfortunately, there was an earthquake last night. We don't know the death toll over in Taiwan, but if there is a volcano erupting, that can really affect populations. It doesn't matter if you have a high density or a low density if it erupts right in a city or where people are. If we have a village outside of a city and the volcano erupts right between them and hits both of them, it's going to affect them both equally. Now, you could argue this, say, I don't know, Iceland. They have an active volcano going on. They had to evacuate one of their major fishing towns, but there's only 30,000 people. The closest large city and the only large city is Reykjavik, and that has about 130 to 150,000 people. About half the population of the island is there. But it missed it. So, density dependent versus independent volcanoes, it just depends on where it shows up, but it's still an environmental factor that doesn't care if you're a large or small population. Does everybody have the idea of population effects? I'm always going to talk about disease and infectious disease. I always am. But I want to hammer home the idea that ecology can be asked and examined in all aspects of biology and even biochemistry if you look at it in the same way. Because biochemistry is just population. Whether you have a high concentration of your product that or your substrate that your enzyme binds, or a low concentration. Still similar questions. You're just asking it in different terminology in chemistry. That's all. Okay, now I finished up with factors talking about what's intrinsic to the organism. Physiological differences. You can have point mutations that allow a subspecies of this mouse to survive better because it doesn't get killed by a certain toxin from a scorpion. And so it can use those scorpions as its food source. There is an actual example of that, of a subspecies of mouse in the Southwest that is resistant to bark spider poison. It's a smaller scorpion, or spider, bark scorpion poison or venom. And that venom usually incapacitates the mouse. It's extremely painful. But this mouse has a point mutation where that toxin doesn't affect the receptor. And so it doesn't get hurt, but now it has a tasty little treat it can hunt, basically. And so it has a niche that is not able to be exploited by all the rest of the mice. So it's spread into that area, and that's the major population of mice in that area. It has an ecological niche. Behavior, well, we can talk about orcas all day and how they are trained by their parents, reared by the mother, actually, to learn how to hunt in a successful way and survive in certain areas hunting. And of course, anatomy. Whales that can dive deeper because of the mammalian diving reflex and how they can stay down deep and go deeper than most mammals and hunt specialized food. Sperm whales and deep sea squid. We never see the squid. We always see the examples of the battles, the epic battles, which must be happening. To get a little trail camera on a sperm whale, but good luck belling that cat. So anatomy can be a key to exploit that resource or allow that species to thrive. Which gets us into the idea of understanding these animals. And I'm sure you've heard of people spending their whole life understanding like a spotted tree owl in the Northwest or a lizard in the desert. And you're going, well, what's the use of that? It's basic science. I do basic science. With toxins and chlamydia and Lyme disease and West Nile and such like that. But there's also life histories that are really important because we understand that we don't understand much about life. Every time we think we do as biologists going, we understand life. Well, nature throws us a curveball and goes, except for this. Or we have a technique to understand this in a better light or a more whole or complete package. So, understanding how everything fits into the environment, not just us and then everything working around us, everything from a frog to a bush in the forest, especially these animals that have complicated animal behaviors and life cycles, and which may help propagate and encourage and support the environment in ways we don't really understand yet. We have to understand these things. So, for example, I really like looking at the frogs because they have some interesting life cycles. Frogs have tadpoles. Tadpoles grow up to be, frogs. And the life cycle continues, right? Well, very soon, theoretically, when it warms up and stops snowing, we will start having the spring peepers in wet areas in Wisconsin. You'll be able to hear them. It's a sign of spring. And then you'll also hear some bullfrogs and tree frogs. They're calling. That is mating calls. And they will draw in males and females. The females will lay the eggs. The males will inseminate them. And then we'll start seeing some tadpoles and ponds and everything. But that's only one of many of the different types of frogs. So we have a number of different types. Let's start with the wood frog here. These are all eggs, so they go for quantity instead of quality here. And they will lay them in hollows of trees where there's a lot of water, stagnant water or something like that, and hollows with a lot of leaves, okay, where they have moisture this whole time until the eggs can develop and little froggies are hopping everywhere. Okay, that's more common than what we think of as mouth brooding frogs, where they will literally hold the eggs in their mouth and the little froggies and tadpoles in their mouth, not swallowing them, so that they can develop and protect them. We have an extreme here where they just go off and let these things, these tadpoles develop and survive or not survive on their own. So they have very few behaviors of nurturing. And so the survival rate is low, but they make a lot of them. There's fewer eggs in this case in the mouth brooding frog, but there's a lot of nurturing behavior. I can't remember if it's male or female for that one. I always get confused about that because there's a number of them where the males are brooding. So, but this one is protecting. This one's getting to food sources, keeping them from predation, keeping them in moist areas. So they have a better survival rate. Now, the poison, or this is the strawberry poison arrow frog. They're infamous for being poisonous. That is only if they have their alkaline beetle that they eat in the Amazon rainforest. If they don't have that beetle, they don't secrete, process that and make a toxin out of it. So a number of people have now had those as pets. They're pretty cute, but they don't make a lot of eggs. What they do have is this ability to transport their tadpoles, bebes, to the next cupped water source. So if it dries out or if there's predation, they can have them stick on their back and move them to the next source. Again, a behavior and a physiological adaptation that allows them to bring their bebes to fruition or to adulthood more often. Okay. This is not a true frog, but it's a toad. And this toad will bring all of its eggs stuck on its back and bring it with it. So its survival is linked to that, or the eggs are linked to its survival. It's kind of weird, but I've seen worse. Okay, and then we have this Suriname toad, which is very interesting. The eggs, the fertilized eggs, sink into this spongy material in the back of the toad, or the frog, sorry, and then they're like little missile silos. The eggs and then the tadpoles develop in the skin, and then once they're full of frogs, baby frogs, they'll pop out of these little holes in the back. It's somewhat disturbing. It's also cool, but it's somewhat disturbing, especially when you see what are those holes, and oh my goodness, something living is popping out of it kind of idea. So for those people who have that phobia, I would not look at videos for that. Even as a biologist, I love learning about life, but that one's kind of disturbing. It's definitely an anatomical and physiological ability that helps nurture, and a behavior, I guess, helps nurture those animals and allows them to survive longer. So we have the entire gamut here, where we're talking about their life cycle, their animal behavior, their how they reproduce, and how that allows them to survive in that particular environment. And this is just with frogs. Imagine if we're talking about this with all the animals, even the bacteria. This could be very important to fully defining that environmental niche, that that climate, that region, ecoregion. If we can understand the ecoregion more, we can understand the effects of humans on that ecoregion and see what we can mitigate to make sure this is as natural as possible while still using that area. Theoretically, if we understand enough about the environment, the life cycling, the population rate growth and limiting factors, we can predict with a high amount of certainty how any effect on their environment will affect overall the ecology. But that's a lot of basic history That's a lot of life histories, and it's a lot of understanding of the environment and what all is involved with defining that environment to get there. That's the ultimate goal, is to really be able to predict and understand that niche, that environment. We have a ways to go, but in life histories, we can start predicting, well, how big is this population going to get? Bacteria will keep reproducing or undergoing binary fission until they run out of components, and then they'll use the components left over from their own dead in their population. We can't necessarily do that with everything. So we have this calculation, and we call it a K-selection. It's basically where we balance this carrying capacity. Remember, that is the one term I wanted you to know in calculating population growth, the carrying capacity of that specific environment based on what we know of their life histories. If we understand what limits or controls their growth, food source, the size of their range of movement, their migration, what have you, their amount of reproduction per individual per generation, we can start predicting how large of a population we can get. And that's where the carrying capacity comes in. So in this case, we're looking for stable equilibrium. When we will have, if we introduce or reintroduce an animal into a environment, how quickly it will start filling up that environment and get to a stable life and death phase, and what that population is going to be. A perfect example for this, how it wasn't quite figured out yet, was reintroducing the timber wolf to Wisconsin. So they put in about 100 or 50 breeding pairs or something like that. And then they started doing some studies on how many there were. And the population blew up to over 2,000, because we have a ton of deer in this state. We do not have enough people hunting. We have too many population areas to keep them under control. And I think everybody knows the old Wisconsin goodbye, showing that we care for you, is not just goodbye, watch out for you. Okay. I don't know of many people who haven't had either close encounter with hitting a deer with their car, or actually hit a deer with their car. I've only managed to bag one. And that wasn't a happy time, because I had to sit out in the middle of nowhere. That was before cell phones, as in there was not cell phone reception in the swamps by Baraboo. So we have that equilibrium, and we haven't reached that equilibrium yet with wolves in the state. We're trying to reach it without having starving wolves going after livestock and pets. They don't seem to attack humans, but we don't want to push the subject. So, which is why we have a limited hunt. And it sounds horrible for people outside the state or people who don't understand, and we're trying to reach the carrying capacity in the most caring way we can. We do not want to have wolves starving to death. We also don't want them to be attacking the pet dog. So we have to get to this carrying capacity in the correct way. We didn't have all the information or all the calculations really necessary to understand that they move. They have large packs, and they travel in a large amount across the state to get to where the food is. Okay, so how we get to a sustainable population, we can't have the exponential growth. We have to have that stable equilibrium, and that's how we, knowing all these factors, is how we get to that predicted carrying capacity. So for example, we can use this for dandelions. We are almost to the dandelion season. For those people who own houses, it is a horrifying season for most. If you like that monoculture lawn and like to put poisons on it to keep it a monoculture instead of having it a little bit more natural and fewer poisons on it, I may be biased about this, you will have dandelions popping up. Okay, and you cannot stop this unless you put a lot of poisons in it. So if you look at it and put it by this carrying capacity idea, it has very small individuals. You could have a lot in a square footage. They grow quickly, they have a short lifespan, they mature very quick, and look at this. We can call this offspring. They have a lot of them and they spread very far and are prolific. They also spread by root systems sometimes. So you can have a very quick spread, but it's literally throwing it to the wind and seeing where the wind will carry it. So there is no care for the offspring, so you can have a high die-off. If you put in all these things, you can have a high carrying capacity per square acre. Now, if you take those same characteristics and look for, say, a brown bear or a grizzly bear, you are going to find that you also have behavioral changes. The bears, in this case, usually have maximum of 2 young. They spend 2 years rearing them, so they usually survive. They are trained how to fend for themselves, and they have a high survival rate. So lots of maternal, and it's definitely maternal because the males will tend to try to eat them after a while because they're slow, and the guys are a bunch of jerks. They have a very long lifespan where they can have 20, 30, or even 40 years on average of survival. And they will tend to have a stable environment around them. Now, they do have a large hunting range. So they'll have a large square footage, as in square mile radius of where they will go. They will go after the food. They'll actually migrate to rivers if there's salmon runs or something like that. But it depends on the geographic area, but they have a large area. So you cannot have a lot of bears per square mile. Otherwise, there tends to be fights and fewer survive. So this equilibrium means the carrying capacity is very small per square mile. Okay. So extremes here. Questions on this? We can only predict this if we have the life histories and knowledge about their whole life cycle. Okay. So we can also look at it from a food net kind of idea. We used to talk about the not really the food pyramid, but a hierarchy of food transfer, energy transfer. But we can look at it as in, where is the energy coming from? Where is it going? That's essentially what the food net is. Where do higher order predators get their food source from? And then we can also predict where they're going to be and how many of them there are going to be by that. So this is just another way of tying in the carrying capacity by talking about, well, how much energy is there? Where does everything get their energy? What happens if we change or disrupt the lower sources of energy for all the predators and higher life forms? And this is something we have to ask when we're putting in major projects in, say, a disrupted or in a desert area or in a forest area that usually has more square footage and certain energy sources. So it isn't as ridiculous as stopping the American economy when you're talking about the ecology of it. Now, it does sometimes seem to be gone to extremes, but the idea is that we do not want to disrupt a major part of the energy cycle. Personally, I always liked Teddy Roosevelt's idea of responsible land management because he was an ecologist, or at least he understood as a naturalist the ecology of things, and that we had to have a balanced approach. We can't put all of nature in a glass box. It is a resource that all Americans should have, both economically in a responsible way and for the beauty of it. So he created the national park system. He wanted to put land away for future generations. And at that time, he was considered a crazy, raving environmentalist hippie. if we use terms from today. Because people looked at it as a vast resource that would never go away, so we should just use it as much as possible. He understood that that could go away because he was a naturalist. He understood some lower form of how this worked and what would happen if we disrupted it. And I'm a personal fan of Teddy Roosevelt because he is like a real life Chuck Norris. You can't prove me wrong on that one. That guy was insane. In a good way. Okay, so we have to look at this food net. We call them trophic levels. Basically, the producers at this photosynthetic area, plants, algae, bacteria, and then what eats them. And that's that transfer of photonic energy to chemical energy. And then that chemical energy in the form of sugars and nutrients being passed on to herbivores. And from there, that energy can be passed on to carnivores, and then finally the top carnivore or the apex predator, if you want to use that sensationalized term. So we can look at this and how this energy is being cycled and what happens if we take some or a number of steps out. How much are we going to disrupt that area? For example, who likes mosquitoes here? I have a love-hate relationship because I did a lot of research in my clinical micro on how they transferred West Nile virus. Entomologists love them. I know at least one person in this in the department that'll say heartily, yes, they love mosquitoes, and that's Dr. Ethan Degner. He's an entomologist, person who studies insects. Now, most entomologists will not like the idea of a laser fence that can identify mosquitoes and burn them out of the air at 25 feet. Somebody designed that. Somebody from IBM took 500 bucks worth of eBay parts and a Blu-ray disc laser and found or made a device that can identify mosquitoes by the pitch of their wing sound and a high-speed, high-end camera and point a laser in that direction and burn them out of the air at 25 or 30 of them per second. That's pretty good. Sign me up. Except we need mosquitoes for bats, insectivores, in order for that trophic level to not be disturbed. However, there is one mosquito that entomologists agree that we don't care about and would not disrupt anything. And that's Aedes aegypti. Aedes aegypti is also known as the tiny Asian tiger mosquito. And they bite and it hurts. And they're very voracious for humans, and they carry dengue, Zika, malaria, West Nile virus, chikungunya, a number of other ones. They're disease carriers. So if we can figure out how to tune that laser fence to kill all those, everybody would be okay with it. We know that they're not directly eaten by any of these trophics. They have other food sources. So if we burn that one out, we can get rid of a major disease disruption. So I tie that in as a way to understand all these trophic levels for what we can and cannot destroy in nature. I'm personally okay with wiping out that one. Genocide on an entomological level. But you have to do it right. I show a picture here of another way to look at it, that sometimes if we have a lot of photosynthesis and a lot of pollution, say from fertilizer runoff into the streams, we can have algae blooms. They'll block the photosynthesis, and then all of a sudden we don't have that trophic transfer of energy because it's literally choked out all the oxygen and the light from correct photosynthesis for the correct animals and plant matter, and so therefore it can't go to the fish. So it's an example of how we need to know about these energy levels and what feeds on what. And that's why fertilizer runoff is bad. I could talk about ecology a lot, but we have to move on. Are there any questions on ecology? We also tie this into the specific geographic area, the ecological region. So you can talk about alpine tundra, you can talk about a coral reef system, you can talk about a mountainous area above 10,000 feet, and all those different environmental strains and changes to that area, and what does and doesn't grow there, and how it ties into this ecological net and life histories in that area. People literally spend their whole lives understanding a spider on a mountain. Sometimes they'll help translate into a biological or medical treatment. A lot of times it doesn't, but we don't know. Studying sponges in the ocean at one time was not understood that it was going to be saving millions of lives through discovering an anti-cancer treatment. But it was because of basic science and understanding, well, hey, these sponges don't grow right next to each other. I wonder why in this staggered pattern or a very regular pattern. I wonder why that is. And they got down to the biochemical reason and said, holy crap, we just discovered an anti-cancer drug. Basic science, we don't know what the next one is out there, but it will help us in the long run. And it helps our appreciation of nature. Personally, as a Christian, the good stewardship idea of we shouldn't be putting crap out in our environment, and we should appreciate what God has created should be a major focus for us as stewards for the next generation, as well as appreciation of what God has blessed us with. If nothing else. Okay. Now, it is a little bit disjointed because we're going to have 10 minutes of this, and then we're going to talk about eyeballs next time. But we do need to spend the last part of our semester talking about evolution. Evolution in a very specific way, not eons and dinosaurs and everything, but we're talking about the ecological, or not the ecological, the link between all animals on the planet. So, basically, in this part, you're going to have to know some of the common names for the animals, some Latin names, full Latin names. I'll show you an example of that later on. And I will give you very specific animals that you need to know the Latin names for. So kingdom, phylum, sometimes class, I have classes that you'll need to know, and then only sometimes there's going to be orders. Okay? I want you to be able to appreciate the nomenclature and why we have this evolutionary theory and linking of all animals coming. As long as it's close enough that I can understand it, that's about it. Yeah. Because some of these, I mean, many people, I still spell some of them wrong, but I've had, 40 years of work on it. Yeah. So if there's a life history, a life cycle that I need you to know, I will have it on the slide, and I will tell you need to know it. Okay. Now, you will need to know the characteristics on how we split them up into groups, and I'll try to be very clear about that. I'll give you a number of examples, because at the final, I have a group of animals that you're going to sort by the correct physiological and anatomical differences to separate them down to class, not just phylum, but class, and sometimes order. It depends on how much I feel that everybody's understood about it. Okay. I will point them out multiple times and show you different ways you can separate them out. But you will be required to do that. It is painful for me to read them, but if I tell you ahead of time and give you examples, we'll have some practice examples towards the end of lab, where I will give you some examples and you'll sit in groups and try to figure it out and put your answer on the board. And I will literally have the same question on the test or something very, very similar to that. And I will tell you right now, even with 2 hours of practice on almost exactly the same question, 10% of you will leave it blank. And it is 20% of that grade or 15% of your final grade. I do not understand, guys. Try to be not that group. Don't be that 10 to 15%. Okay. Now, phylogeny is merely the study of evolutionary relationships. Science likes quantification. Science likes proof. This is where, being a Christian and a scientist, you can be both. Just be aware that evolution is not necessarily an evil term, but it's merely science's way to define life. Now, it can be taken to an extreme and be used as a belief system. And evolutionists really hate that because they don't like using the word belief at all. But many of them do. They put their blinders on for looking at lots of questions we have no answers for and saying this is absolute proof of evolution. Now, I am a creationist. I can be both. I can understand that we need a framework to define life. And my faith is what I hope for and being certain of what I cannot see. Hebrews 11. If I try to prove my faith and say, look, here's the proof that evolution isn't true, and I find that proof, which is not going to happen. It isn't like God made an oopsie. I don't need my faith anymore, do I? If I'm trying to prove my faith, also, there is a danger to this, and I would like to point this out to all Christians in here. If you are trying to prove your faith and prove to somebody that evolution is false, you're taking power away from the Holy Spirit, or trying to. The Holy Spirit is the only one who can actually cause people to come to faith. You thinking that you need to help it along is actually not having full faith in the Holy Spirit, that God's word is sufficient. So be careful that you do not fall. Devil will prey on your fears, on even your passion for spreading God's word. Now, I can talk about it more, but I need to focus on this. So all this is the study of relationships between animals. And we usually have it as a graphical representation. I'm going to show you many different ways that it's been shown. A lot of the time you'll see it in this taxonomy idea, where you have a root ancestor, and then you'll have branches off of this separating out animals or organisms by physical characteristics, either a skeletal system, or they fly, or they have gills, or they have a developmental stage that all of these have and this one doesn't. When we have a branch point, whenever you write this down, you need to know what is the differentiating factor here. What causes the branch? Do these all have multicellularity and this one doesn't? Okay, well, that's a big one. If all of them are multicellular and this one has true tissues and this branch doesn't, that's a main characteristic. Tissues. You have to know what this branch point is in order to define the animals here and the animals here. So all of these have tissues. What's the next big thing that will separate them? Do they have tissue, multiple tissue layers, or do they just have one? Things like that. So when you're trying to define these different phyla, especially phyla, but even classes, you need to know what differentiates them from each other. And it's usually more than one thing. So if something down here has a difference, you need to know that there's a difference here, there's a difference here that it shares with everything here, and a difference here that shares with everything over here versus here. So you start getting, as you get more specific to species, you will have a list of characteristics, some of which are shared with all the rest of these, and some of which are not shared. So make sure you have that list. What it has, what it doesn't have. Okay? It's key. So you can have physiological traits, so anatomical and physiological, so we can talk about biochemistry. But now we have also gotten down to developmental, what happens when they're in certain embryological steps, and then we get to genetic differences. We have the technology to sequence basically anything out there, and we've done a lot of sequencing. I remember when this first science paper came out about shotgun sequencing for a genome. It took 10 years to sequence the human genome. Now we can do it in less than a month, easily. We can sequence 1,000 different bacterial genomes in a drop of water in a week, less than a week. We have the technology that we could only dream of. And it took tens of millions of dollars to do that first human genome. Now it's cents on the dollar. I mean, you can do it for less than $500 easily nowadays. Your own personal genome, by the way. We are getting to the point where we can start screening you for genetic differences and seeing if we can treat you early for diabetes or slow the advance of diseases now. So, what I do need you to know is that we have different terminology. It's called taxa for this. We have overall domains. There's 3 main domains, and then we have kingdoms underneath that. So for example, we are all eukaryotes, plants, animals, protists, all of that. Bacteria and archaea are different. Those are, at least bacteria are prokaryotes. Archaea is kind of a mix. We have a number of kingdoms, plants, protists, animals. And then we get down to the phylums. We're chordates. We have a spinal cord. Then we have mammalia, primates, family is hominids, and the genus is Homo, and then the species is sapiens. So to get our full Latin name, we will take the genus and the species and put it together. We'll have it in italics. The genus is capitalized. The species, the second name, is not capitalized. So if we say Homo sapiens once in our paper, and after that we don't want to write out the full name, we'll abbreviate it H, capital H period, sapiens in lowercase, all in italics or underlined. But you got to be careful with spell check because it'll try to capitalize that. So you always have to be careful about that. So we do the same thing for bacteria. Sometimes we have something like this, which seems kind of hippy-dippy, but this splits it off into all the different phylums we're going to look at. And we're going to go through each of these phylums, talk about their different characteristics, why they have their similarities and differences to everything else, and give you examples in each class and why it's so cool. And some of these will greatly disturb you, especially when we get to the parasites. I have pictures, it'll be cool. Okay. Okay, so keep that in mind. We're gonna have that specialized person coming in, Dr. Dan Robertson, on Friday. So please attend. I will have a recording of it, but I would like you to attend.